How many of you are here with your favorite teacher? Clap. You are all very smart because since that teacher is sitting by you, it's a good thing you clapped for her or him. And we are very grateful, and I know that you all see yourselves and you're waving. Woo, that's a lot of fun, right? Enjoy it, it'll end soon. Okay. All right, good. That was your time on TV. It's like the camera at a football game, right? Okay, thank you, thank you, thank you. In order to enjoy, if we can stop now, that's great. In order to enjoy the full time with our author, we are going to get started. And I always like to have students come up here and tell us about the author. So I am proud to introduce Jordan, who's here from Cypress Bay High School, and he will introduce our esteemed author today.
Good afternoon. Kelly Barnhill lives in Minnesota with her husband and 3 children. She's the author of 4 novels, most recently, The Girl Who Drank the Moon, the book in your hands, which was a winner of the Newbery Medal. The Witch's Boy received 4-starred reviews and was a finalist for the Minnesota Book Awards. Kelly Barnhill has been awarded writing fellowships from Jerome Foundation, the Minnesota State Arts Board, and the McKnight Foundation. Ladies and gentlemen, Kelly Barnhill.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am so happy to see you guys here. What a great book fair. You guys realize how awesome this is that you guys get to come with all these books and all these authors coming from all around the world? That's really amazing. My name is Kelly Barnhill, and I write books for my job. It's a weird job. And I know this because I've had a lot of really weird jobs in my life. I was a teacher for a long time. If you ask your teachers, is your job weird? Your teacher will say, super weird. So I was a teacher for a while. Prior to that, I was a secretary for a while. I was a receptionist for a while. I worked as a waitress. I worked as a bartender. I was a park ranger for the National Park System. I was a wildland firefighter for a while. I was trained in search and rescue. I was a janitor for a while. I worked in a bakery. I worked in a carpentry shop. There's another one. I'm missing one. Oh yeah, I did events planning. So what we can learn from this is that I got fired a lot and that I don't have any marketable skills. And so I'm really glad that they let me do this because otherwise my family would starve. One of the things that I love about being a writer, particularly a writer for children, is that once a person is a teacher, you're really always a teacher. You never really stop being a teacher. And so one of the things that I really enjoy is that I get to kind of return to my teacher self every once in a while. Sometimes I do things like this where I present in front of schools. Sometimes I go into schools and I do residencies with kids. But no matter what, all of my work comes back to this fundamental nature of the relationship between kids and their books, right? Kids and their books and kids and their stories. And the reason why this matters to me is that for us as human beings, we are born to tell stories. We are born to tell stories. We are monkeys who tell stories, right? All of us are. We can't help it. It's part of how our brains are wired. Now, here's a thing that you may not know that is true. So human beings have been telling stories since before we could talk. Okay? We've been telling stories since before we could talk. The structures in our brain that we use to process stories are really, really, really old. how many of you are singers? How many of you are singers when nobody is around? Okay, yeah, more. Funny that, right? Okay, here's a thing you might not know. Singing and music are actually an ancient form of storytelling. We have been singing since before we could talk. We have been making music since before we could talk. Music is older than language. How many of you are dancers? How many of you are dancers when nobody's around? Okay, yeah, more of us, right? Awesome. So here's another thing. Here's another thing that you might not know. Dancing is actually older than language too. Dancing is actually a really, really old form of storytelling and communication. How many of you are artists? Are you painters, or drawers, or comic book makers, or sculptors? Awesome. Awesome. Okay, we have been making art since before we could talk. Art is older than language. It is older than speech. Eventually, human beings created language, and they created language kind of all at once, and it's still a mystery as to why. Okay? Later on after that, we wrote down our first words. We created written language. We created language so that we could tell our stories more efficiently and more effectively, and then we created written language, and then those stories could stay. The oldest piece of writing that we have in the world, the oldest piece, okay, I've seen it, it's on display in New York City, was not a law, it was not a receipt, it was not a business transaction. It had nothing to do with ownership or being owned. It had nothing to do with how we accumulate wealth. It had nothing to do with any of that. It was a story. It was the story of Gilgamesh. It's the oldest story that exists in humanity. And that actually makes me kind of excited whenever I think that. Because what that means is that when we are engaging in stories, okay, the stories that we read, the stories that we tell, the stories that we write down, the stories that we watch, the stories that we act out, the stories that we sing, the stories that we draw, and the stories that we just run through our head just by ourselves. All of these are profoundly human. They are profoundly human. And when we connect ourselves to stories and make stories, we are connecting ourselves to the whole human family, right? How many of you like to read? How many of you like to write? How many of you like to act? How many of you like to sing? All of these things are fundamental. All of these things are fundamental. And this is my message to you, and this is why I'm telling you this now. This is why I'm telling you this now. Because when you guys sit down to think about a story or to write a story, that story matters. It really, really matters. It is part of your birthright, right? It's part of your birthright. And so it shouldn't, and so I'm telling you this because I want you to make sure that it matters to you. Because it sure as heck matters to me. And it matters to the whole world too. I think that there are probably a handful of you, maybe 2 handfuls, maybe 10 handfuls of you here right now, who right now have stories that are happening in your notebooks, okay? You are the only person on earth who can write that story, and it would please me endlessly if one day one of your books is on a shelf with one of mine. That would be awesome, wouldn't it? It would be awesome. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about my work, and then I'm going to read to you, and then we're going to have some question and answer. Does that sound okay? Because I know a lot of you do have questions about the nature of stories, or how books get written, or that weird process between idea and scribbles and manuscript and actually having a book on the shelf. Like, it's a weird and complicated process. And even though this is my job, I don't know all of it. But I can tell you some parts, okay? I write stories with magic in them. I really enjoy writing stories with magic in them. Most of my time as a writer, I write novels, and I really, really like writing novels. But I also write short stories too. Most of my short stories are written for grown-ups. I've written a few for kids, but most of my short stories are grown-up short stories. And they've been published in different kinds of places. And eventually, actually in February, I have a collection coming out of grown-up short stories, and that's going to be called Dreadful Young Ladies. And I'm excited about that because I really like short stories, but really what I like is writing novels for kids. That's my favorite thing. I write novels with magic in them primarily because I grew up as a kid assuming the possibility of magic. I was the kid who would go walking in the woods and was always convinced that there were more things that were present around me that I could see. I was convinced that that state of wonder that I lived in was representative of a more wonderful, more unknowable, and wilder world around me. I don't always believe in magic now. Sometimes I do. There's a lot of things in my life that have felt pretty magical. But one of the reasons why I like to write books that have magic for kids is that all of you guys are in this process of growing up, right? And all of you are in this process of going from a place of unknowing to knowing. And that can feel really scary sometimes. And that can feel really confusing sometimes. And that can make it feel as though you're sometimes wandering in the dark. One of the things about writing fantasy is that we take an opportunity to see the world as it isn't in order to be able to pull apart the way that things are, in order to see the world as it is, right? Which means that when we write in fantasy, we can use the tools, something called allegory, which is something you've probably learned about in your English classes. And we can start to examine these bigger questions about what it means to be a human being. We can start talking about love and honor and courage. We can start talking about the roots of tyranny, or why there is this division between those who have and those who do not. We can talk about justice and our fundamental humanity, right? Which is one of the things that I love about writing fantasy, because we're not just writing about the worlds that we create. We're creating a story that always reflects back on the world that we're in, right, and asks questions. And that's important for kids because kids are built out of questions, right? You're basically one giant question, all of you. Because part of the thing about growing up is realizing that the things that you thought were true aren't always entirely true, right? And sometimes our narrow understanding has to get bigger and broader. And that's where all of you are right now. It's an exciting time, but it's also sometimes scary, right? Which is why we read books. We read books because a book can be a mirror to help us to see ourselves clearly. It can be a lamp to be able to light up the dark places around us, the places that we don't know, that we can't see. A book can be a map to help us to guide our way. A book can be a tool to help us build something new. A book can be a salve or or medicine to help heal us, right? A book can be all kinds of things, and which is why I like to do this for kids, because I like to be part of that conversation, the conversation that you're having right now. Okay. I wrote this book, The Girl Who Drank the Moon. Here it is. I wrote this book for a couple of different reasons. First of all of my books start with a box. That's how I start writing. Before I can start writing a book, I have to think about it for a really, really, really long time. Oftentimes, 2 or 3 years. I have to just think about it. And during that time of thinking, I always have a box. And I have 2 boxes in my house right now. One for the book that I'm currently in draft number, like 67 or something. I've been drafting this book for a really long time. But I have a box for this particular book that's called The Sugar House. And it has all kinds of information on fairy tales, as well as diabetes, as well as stuff about the juvenile justice system. It's got all kinds of stuff in there as I think about this book. I've got another book that I'm going to start drafting soon that's called Dispatch from the Hideous Laboratories of Dr. Otto van Dracht. And that has lots of information in it on piracy and shipbuilding and the Holy Roman Empire and alchemy and the Habsburgs and metallurgy and mathematics and Leonardo da Vinci, weirdly. And also, did I say alchemy already? Well, alchemy and poisons. So I'm really excited about that one when I start going. When I started this book, the first thing that went in the box was a poem. And it was actually the last poem that appears in the book, the one that goes, "The heart is built of starlight and time, a pinprick of longing lost in the dark, an unbroken cord linking the infinite to the infinite. My heart wishes upon your heart, and that wish is granted. Meanwhile, the world spins. Meanwhile, the universe expands. Meanwhile, the mystery of love reveals itself again and again in the mystery of you." Now, I wrote that poem by accident, and really I can't even take credit for it because really the person who wrote that poem is a swamp monster. Now, I was out for a run one day with my dog. I have a dog named Sirius Black. I know. You know, unfortunately and alas, he's literally nothing like his namesake. He's super emotionally needy, so he wouldn't make it 5 minutes in Azkaban. But anyway, Sirius Black and I were out for a run, and I suddenly had this image in my head of a swamp monster, a 4-armed swamp monster with a great big tail that snaked around his whole body and eyes that moved independently of with one another. And he was holding a daisy in one hand, and he was holding a flute in the other hand, and he was reciting this poem, this very poem that I just recited to you just now. And I stopped in my tracks, and I paid attention to it, and I thought about it, and I committed the poem to memory, and then I ran home and wrote it down. Now, here's the thing that you should know about me. I'm not a visual thinker at all. I never have been. I remember feeling really amazed when I learned that people could close their eyes and picture something and it would be an actual picture. That's not how my brain works. I'm also on the facial blindness spectrum, and so recognizing faces is also really hard. I have 3 kids. They're awesome. I love them so much. But it's actually very difficult for me to picture their faces in my head. I can. It's work. It's a lot of work, and it kind of exhausts me. But I have their voices in my head all the time. All the time. My brain works almost entirely in language and in sound and in smell and in touch. That's how I imagine things. And so when I do get these sudden visions, these sudden images, it doesn't happen very often. It always wears me out, but I always pay attention to them because I know that my brain is telling me something important. So I ran home and I wrote down the poem. And I wrote it on a little note card, and I kind of stared at the poem for a minute. And then I turned the poem over, and I wrote the words "swamp monster." And I looked at that for a minute, and then under that I wrote, "His name is Glurk." Now, I'm a big believer in trusting my instincts as a writer and trusting the first place that my imagination goes to. One of the challenges, I think, in being a writer is learning how to get rid of that mean voice, you know, that lives right here in your ear saying, "Oh, don't write that down, that's dumb," right? "Oh, don't write that down, that's bad," right? Do you guys have that voice? Yeah? It's a mean voice, isn't it? It's really mean, and it doesn't have any place in your head at all. It doesn't. Because it interrupts your writing. It interrupts your imagination and it interrupts your thinking. And it's really important to get rid of that voice, especially in your first draft. Especially in your first draft. So I have learned to really trust the places where my imagination takes me. And so I knew that I was going to write a new book. I knew it would have a swamp monster in it. I knew that this swamp monster would tell poetry, but that is the only thing that I knew. So I got a box, and I put the poem in the box, and I spent the next year, and the next year after that, and the next year after that, just thinking. Just thinking. And as I thought, lots of other things started to occur to me and started to come into the box. I knew that I was going to write a story that would have a bog in it. I knew that I would write a story that had a volcanic landscape in it. I knew that I would write a story about a girl who does not yet know who she is or what she is capable of. I knew that I would write a girl who would be all angles and edges and frustration, because turning 13 can be really frustrating, right? Because suddenly the world that you thought it was is not that way at all, and that is frustrating. And sometimes the people, the adults in your life who love you so much are not always entirely truthful, and that is frustrating, right? And so as I started to write and as I started to throw little bits and pieces of research and knowledge and things that were true and sentences that pleased me and little poems here and there, things that I knew that were true about Firion, things that I knew that were true about Glurk, things that I knew that were true about Zan and the Protectorate and all of the machinations of this particular world, right? All went into the box. And as that started to grow, I started to realize I'm writing a story about false narratives, right? I'm writing a story about growing up. I'm writing a story about grief and longing. I'm writing a story about how tyranny happens, how codes of power get hidden in stories, how hatred gets hidden in stories, how intolerance gets hidden in stories. And sometimes we have to really analyze the stories that we are being given, the stories that sort of like swirl around us in the culture, to be able to ask who benefits from this story and who loses, right? And sometimes we really have to question how much bias is in the stories that we tell so that we can undo it, right? That's why I set the story up the way that I did, where we had the false narratives being told to a child counteracted with those same facts being verifiably true but turned around in the story, right? That's why I did it that way. So so I followed this story where it led. And eventually I drafted the thing, and eventually I turned it in, and I was convinced that everybody would hate it. This is true. The story meant a lot to me, but I thought nobody's going to get this. Nobody's going to get this. And when I turned it into my editor, I literally turned it in with a note of apology. And because sometimes we are blind to our own work, you know? And she said, no, it's fine. I said, nobody's going to like this book. It's going to totally tank. I really apologize. I'll do better next time, I swear, is what I told my editor. Now, the life that this story has taken has been not what I expected at all. I did not expect for it to be on the New York Times bestseller list for a lot of months. I did not expect for it to be translated now into 34 different languages and be all over the world. I did not expect to get this sticker on it. You know what happens when you win the Newbery? This is what happens when you win the Newbery. You get woken up at 5 a.m, and on the other side of the line is a room full of super cheerful librarians, yelling, "Congratulations!" And you're not able to make human sentences because you just were woken up from a deep, dead sleep. Some people at least have an inkling that maybe they might get called that morning, but I had no idea at all. It was literally the last thing on my mind. So, and then they change your life. And it's kind of changed my life. This book has kind of changed my life in ways that I didn't expect and did not anticipate. I'm going to go up here, and I'm going to read to you. And then I think we should open it up for questions. Does that sound okay to you guys? Okay. Here. Oh, is this on? It is. Hello. It's easier if I can be up here because then I can use my hands a little bit better. Got to get to the right page. Okay. So when I was young and in college, loved college. I was a double major. I was an English and theology major, and I loved being both. I studied theology because when I first started college, I actually thought that I would be a nun. This is true. Did not become a nun. I got married and had children instead. But I've always been fascinated in the different ways in which we interact with the larger world and try to make sense of things. I've read sacred texts from all kinds of different religions, and I've read theological treatises from all kinds of different religions, and all of it is really fascinating and wondrous to me. But one of the things about being a fantasy writer is that we are creating worlds that don't exist, which means that we have to put some thought into how those worlds start, which is super fun if you were a theology major. And it also means that sometimes you get to write chapters like this. Chapter 12, in which a child learns about the bog. No child! The witch does not live in the bog. What a thing to say. All good things come from the bog. Where else would we gather our zerin stalks and our zerin flowers and our zerin bulbs? Where else would I gather the water spinach and the muck-eating fish for your dinner, or the duck eggs and frog spawn for your breakfast? If it weren't for the bog, your parents would have no work at all, and you would starve. Besides, if the witch lived in the bog, I would have seen her. Well, no. Of course I haven't seen the whole bog. No one has. The bog covers half the world, and the forest covers the other half. Everyone knows that. But if the witch was in the bog, I would have seen the waters ripple with her cursed footsteps. I would have heard the reeds whisper her name. If the witch was in the bog, it would cough her out the way a dying man coughs out his life. Besides, the bog loves us. It has always loved us. It is from the bog that the world was made, each mountain, each tree, each rock and animal and skittering insect, even the wind was dreamed by the bog. Oh, of course you know this story. Everyone knows this story. Fine. I will tell it if you must hear it one more time. In the beginning, there was only bog and bog and bog and bog. There were no people. There were no fish. There were no birds or beasts or mountains or forest or sky. The bog was everything, and everything was the bog. The muck of the bog ran from one edge of reality to the other. It curved and warbled through time. There were no words. There was no learning. There was no music or poetry or thought. There was just the sigh of the bog and the quake of the bog and the endless rustle of reeds. But the bog was lonely. It wanted eyes with which to see the world. It wanted a strong back with which to carry itself from place to place to place. It wanted legs to walk and hands to touch and a mouth that could sing. And so the bog created a body, a great beast that walked out of the bog on its own strong, boggy legs. And the beast was the bog, and the bog was the beast, and the beast loved the bog, and the bog loved the beast, just as a person loves the image of himself in a quiet pond of water and looks upon it with tenderness. And the beast's chest was full of warm and life-giving compassion. He felt the shine of love radiating outward, and the beast wanted words to explain how he felt. And so there were words. And then the beast wanted those words to fit together just so, to explain his meaning. He opened his mouth, and a poem came out. Round and yellow, yellow and round, the beast said, and the sun was born, hanging just overhead. Blue and white and black and gray and a burst of color at dawn, the beast said, and the sky was born. The creak of wood and the softness of moss and the rustle and whisper of green and green and green and green, the beast said. And then there were forests. Everything you see, everything you know, was called into being by the bog. The bog loves us, and we love the bog. A witch in the bog, please. I've never heard anything so ridiculous in all my life. Ladies and gentlemen, hello, hello. All right, so I know that you guys have questions, so let's get to it, shall we? Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Raise your hand, and somebody's going to bring a microphone to you. Okay. You first. Right over here. We've got a question right over here. Okay. Yeah. Why don't you just stand up and say it nice and loud so I can hear you. Awesome. Amazing. Well done. Okay, say it. No. Great question. All right, have a seat. So sometimes I go to places that aren't Minnesota and kids don't know what a bog is, and that's fine. I'm going to tell you. So a bog is actually it's a landscape structure. So it's similar to a swamp. You guys know about swamps because you live in Florida. So a bog is interesting though because a bog is actually made of layers and layers and layers of material, of green material that turns into this sort of spongy structure over time. In Ireland, they have big bogs, and the spongy stuff is called peat. And so what they'll do is they'll cut out the peat and dry it, and it makes a really good fuel. In Minnesota, we have huge bogs, and in fact, the whole upper quarter of the state is basically one big bog. You guys have heard of the Mississippi River, of course, and the Mississippi River starts in Minnesota, and you have probably heard that it starts in a place called Lake Itasca, and that it is so narrow that you can just walk across it. Well, the walking across it part is true, but the Lake Itasca part really isn't, actually, because it is not Lake Itasca that causes the river to form. The river actually comes out of the bog. And the bog is actually amazing. It's this incredibly life-rich place that it's a conduit. It's basically like a superhighway for migratory birds. So like the Arctic terns that go from the Arctic Circle to the Antarctic Circle every single year, they've got the biggest migratory pattern of any bird on Earth. They stop in the bog in Minnesota. And so there's certain times of year that you can come and you just see massive amounts of birds moving through. Your pelicans here stop in Minnesota on their way up to the Hudson Bay. So I don't see them in Minneapolis, but if I drive out to the bog, I can see it. Okay? So that's what a bog is. Great question. Next question. Yeah, can you say? Oh, yeah, go ahead. Oh, there's a line. I see. There's a whole process. Okay, Yes, dear.
How many times did you have to revise and write again and fix?
Ooh, really good question. Okay, so the way that I do revisions is like this. My first draft is always longhand. That is draft 0. The rest of my drafts are all numbered in my. I have each book has their own file, and I number my revisions. The reason why I do this is because I will write myself notes at the beginning, saying this is what I changed and this is what is different. Note this page or whatever. And also because sometimes I will make a decision in my revision process and it'll be the wrong decision and I have to go back. So I have to go back to that particular version so I know where it is. My first book, The Mostly True Story of Jack, I revised 45 times. I know. My second, and I know this because it's numbered in my files. My second book, Iron-Hearted Violet, I revised 52 times. My third book, The Witch's Boy, I revised 71 times. And this book, The Girl Who Drank the Moon, I revised exactly 100 times. So here's the thing, and this is actually really important because I think a lot of kids really get frustrated as writers because they have this erroneous belief that their first draft has to be perfect, right? It doesn't. It doesn't have to be perfect at all. Your first draft is actually not even really writing. Your first draft is raw materials. You're getting all the stuff down that you can play with and work with later. The writing happens in the revision. And so what that means is that you can be as free and non-judgmental as you want when you are writing your first draft. You can put everything down and not talk yourself out of it because you can always fix it later, right? So revision, I'm a fan. I'm a fan. Yes, please, next question.
How do authors think about what to write about?
Oh, really good question. So, I mean, a lot of times authors will, most of their books will start with a question. Like, I wonder what this is. Sometimes they will have moments like I did with having a sudden vision in their head, but most books, I think, start with people asking a question. I wonder what would happen if, and that's where it starts. Great question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
When you were a kid, you wanted to be a writer?
When I was a kid, did I want to be a writer? Depends on where I was in my kidship. So first of all, when I was a kid, I was a delayed reader. So I didn't come to reading until much later than most people. And there's all kinds of reasons for this, but I just was a delayed reader. And I was very good at what we call mimicking reading behaviors. I knew that one should read, and so I didn't read a lot. But what I did do was I told stories. I was the oldest of 5 kids. My mom did childcare for a lot of my cousins, so there were always a lot of kids in my house. And so I would tell stories, and I would tell all kinds of stories about fairies and witches and gnomes and the trees that stop being trees at night and walk around. I would tell stories about like the little people that live in plants. I would tell stories that if you look at a tree bark for long enough, it turns into a map of a world that you cannot get to. And I also would tell stories about hideous and horrible beasts that lived in Lake Calhoun, which was 3 blocks away from my house. And I got in a lot of trouble with that one because it made my little cousin wet the bed, so I had to stop. Sometimes my stories would frighten other children, and sometimes they would frighten me too. I didn't start thinking about becoming a writer, though, until 7th grade. I had this awesome teacher in 7th grade. Her name was Sister Geron, and she was 6'3", and she looked like she was built out of barbed wire. She had this lopey way of walking, but she was awesome. She was a really good teacher, and she gave us a unit on writing short stories where we had to write a short story a week for 6 weeks, which is hard. It's really hard. It's hard for me now, and I'm a grown-up, and this is my job, right? And so, but it was the first time that I had this, that I realized that well of stories that lives inside all of us is inexhaustible. And I can keep on going back and back and back and writing something else. And that was kind of transformational for me. So that's really when I started to think that maybe I wanted to be a writer. Great question.
Did you base the girl on a real person or someone that you know?
Great question. Sort of. I have 3 kids, and my oldest is 18, and I have a 15-year-old and a 13-year-old. And my daughters are my older kids, and for my daughters, they are vigorous thinkers and sometimes are prickly girls too. They're not like Luna, but some of the stuff that they, that they would push against were like Luna. Zan is somewhat based on. I used to work at a shelter for victims of domestic violence, which was run by this nun named Sister Shar Madigan, who was kind of she was this larger than life person who just took care of everybody. And so Zan is kind of based on her. She was also kind of a wise guy too. So anyway, yeah, thank you.
What advice do you have for young writers?
Oh, I've got a lot. So first of all, here's my advice to you. Number 1, give yourself a break. Give yourself a break. You don't have to be perfect. You don't even have to be good right now. All you have to do is produce. And you don't have to produce every day. You don't. Okay? Number two, remind yourself that your work matters. Because it does. Even when your work is bad, it still matters. And that's important. That's important. Even when it's bad, it still matters. Number 3, read everything. This can be hard because sometimes part of getting better at writing is realizing the distance between what you're able to do and what professional people are able to do. And that can sometimes feel daunting, right? Because as you read more, your taste gets better and better and better, which means that what you're able to make is not going to be as good in your estimation as like what is possible. But that's okay. That's okay. That discomfort is actually normal, and it's good, right? It's good because it's what pushes us forward. Read a lot. And number 4, experience everything. Part of being a writer and being a reader is being in this place of fiction, which requires an act of radical empathy, right? Radical empathy. We have to think as another thinks, feel as another feels, and be as another is, right? And so as a result, it is important to be in the world and to be empathetic people, right? And to be wondering, how does that person feel right now? What is that person thinking right now? And how can I be more open to this other person's fundamental humanity, right? So that's the other thing. Okay, great.
Thank you.
Thank you, honey.
How many years did it take you to write the book?
Oh, great question. So this particular book, Girl Who Drank the Moon, this was my fastest novel as far as the drafting of it goes. It only took me 5 months to draft it, and under a year between starting to draft it and actually getting it into my editor after our back and forth. So it was a very fast novel. My first novel took me about 1.5 years to write. My second novel took me, maybe 9 months to draft. My third novel took me 3 years, and this one took me 5 months. And then the book that I'm working on now, The Sugar House, it still is in process, and I've been working on this book for 5 years. So every book is different, and that's fine. That's just what it is.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
How did you get the inspiration to write the title, The Girl Who Drank the Moon?
What was my inspiration, you said?
Yeah.
Okay, really great question. Some titles are really hard, and you think about them for a really long time. And this one was just that's just what it was right from the beginning. And so I don't know if I was particularly inspired by it, but I just once that title popped into my head, it was so obvious that that's what the title needed to be. And also because it scans nicely, because I used to be a poet, so I like things that have that kind of internal rhythm. So great question.
Thank you.
Was your family astonished after you made the book?
So my family was not so much astonished when I made the book, but they were astonished when it got the award. My son Leo, he's 13, and he has his own books that he reads on his own. But we also always have a book that he and I read together, just because it's fun. And we started doing this when he was much younger and was very reading averse, and so that's just what his relationship with books was. And then we just have continued, but. Every year, he and I watch the Newbery Awards together, all the ALA awards, because we read so many books together. We often have like books that we're rooting for, that we really hope will win, and so we'll sort of be like, we'll be cheering for things, or oh well, next time, or whatever. And so when I got the call, so first of all they say don't tell anybody. I said, well, can I tell my family? Okay, yes, you can tell your family. So I woke Leo up. And I said, Leo, I have really amazing news. And he says, what? And I said, I won the Newbery Award. And he kind of stares at me, and he said, the real one? No, they just made a fake one for your mom. Yes, the real one. So anyway, yeah, they were pretty astonished. And then we watched the whole thing, and then my kids cried. So anyway, thank you. I know, they're nice.
Where did you write the book at?
Oh, that's a really good question. So different places. I have an office in my house. It's got my bookshelves and my yoga ball and a little place to sit. And so that's where most of the writing happened. But part of it, I actually started the longhand draft. My husband and I have been married for a really long time, but we were on our honeymoon because it took us that long to go on our honeymoon. And I started actually writing it while I was down there, actually hiking in volcanic landscapes. So that was kind of cool. But then I would write, sometimes I get tired of being in my office, and so I'll go to a coffee shop, or I'll go to the library, or I'll go sit on the, in the living room. So anyway, great question.
All right, thank you.
Is the bog symbolism towards religion?
Really great question. First of all, I'm going to say this. I am a big believer in reader response theory. So what the author intends actually does not matter. It's what the reader makes. That's what matters. So all of you will read a different book, right? Because all of you are bringing your own curiosities and histories and other things that you've read and points of view and belief system. All of that comes to bear in the book, which means that what you build in your imagination is actually more important than what I am thinking about when I'm writing it. And that's really important to remember. It is true that when I wrote the book, I was doing a lot of thinking about the world and what connects us and what happens to us when we die. And so there is a fundamental theology of the book, I would say. It being more, primarily it's what connects us and how we love each other, right? But if you ever go to a bog and see all of those masses and masses of birds, and just hear the life in the ground, it starts to feel, not too off base that the world might have been created in the bog, that this is the primordial stuff from which we all arise. So, great question.
Thank you.
All right, last question.
When did you start your first book?
Oh, really good question. When did I start my first book? I got to think about that. So I was in my 30s for sure. So my son, my third kid, was born when I turned 30, and I started writing seriously after that. And so I'm not exactly sure how old I was when I started it. It came out when I was 37, so I was probably, 32 or 33 when I started my first book. Great question.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. You guys, you were awesome. I know I'm going to be signing books after, so I'll see you then.